Thank you, Father. I'm delighted to be back here. I very much appreciate the invitation, especially since David, who I think was the main instigator, knows very well how much I like to be a fly in the ointment, and hopefully a gadfly in the spirit of friendship and love of truth. So that's what I'll try to be. A couple years ago, I read David's article in New Polity called "What is Liberalism?" And I asked myself as I was reading it, what's missing here? And I found myself answering, both here and generally in the ongoing conversation about the end of liberalism, that it seems there's a distinction that ought to be made between liberal and modern. And so then I asked myself, well, what is that distinction? And I found myself answering that at least politically, and maybe fundamentally, I'm starting to think so, what is distinctly modern is the state. And while liberalism might be looking like it could be over soon, I'm not sure the same can be said about the state, which might in some sense be an irreversible development definitive of modernity. And then I asked myself, well, what would make it irreversible? Or maybe even indispensable? And eventually I thought I had located the answer, which is July 2nd, 1600. But I'm going to leave that cryptic for now, because I'm going to follow David's lead from his liberalism article and start by asking the question that seems to remain most generally unasked: what is the modern state? In his marvelous book, Before Church and State, Andrew Willard Jones, who is with us this evening, tells us frequently that St. Louis' France is not a state, which is true. But since what a state is remains not entirely clear, the question whether the reforms of King Louis and Pope Clement did in fact prepare the ground for the French state also remains unanswered in that book, in my opinion. I think the answer is mostly no, but also a little bit yes. But that too I'll come back to later. So in one sense, it's difficult to say what the state is because it's difficult to see it. The state is the structuring condition of our lives, the water that we swim in. Experientially, we hardly know how to think otherwise than as denizens of a state. This, of course, is famously conveyed by the typical mistranslation of the Greek word polis as city-state, in opposition to, say, nation-state, as if state is a universal category that something belongs to with some specification. It was precisely on this point that Leo Strauss grounded his attempted recovery of pre-modern political philosophy, namely on the attempted recovery of the experience of the polis, which is the original political experience, and, if we are to believe Aristotle, the political experience par excellence, the most revealing political experience. This attempted recovery was phenomenological. Strauss was a student of both Husserl and Heidegger, personal student of theirs. It was an attempt to dig down through conceptual layers of political ideas that obscure the original experience out of which political philosophy arises. In Husserl's terms, we can call it an attempt to recover the life world of the polis, so as to recover the authentic sense of classical political philosophy. And I think Strauss was right that a political phenomenology, which is to say, in this case, a phenomenology of the polis, is a necessary starting point for political philosophizing in the tradition. But we also need a complementary phenomenology of the modern state. Pierre Manon, clearly inspired by Strauss, has endeavored to work this out with, I think, partial success. But Manon leaves also a large lacuna between the end of the Roman Republic and the birth of the modern nation-state, a roughly 15th century lacuna, which he calls the Ciceronian moment. It's a very long moment. This period is defined, in his words, by, quote, the indefinite character of the concrete political form, and the need to formulate a rule of common life in the absence of this form. And this seems to me really, at the end of the day, to be a phenomenological failure. And I think Andrew's book, Before Church and State, provides materials and the beginnings of such a political phenomenology of Christendom, the medieval political order, whatever you want to call it. So, broadly speaking, then, I would contend that an adequate political philosophy requires at least 3 very different political phenomenologies that then may be compared both analogically and dialectically to one another. So having said that then, as a preliminary, I'd like to do 2 things, which is to say I have 2 papers that I haven't entirely melded into one. First, I want to describe some basic features of the political phenomena inherent to the modern state, and then I want to reflect on some questions that overarch the 3 orders, and in particular, since this is the theme of the conference, in particular the question whether the common good is in any sense a political phenomenon. So, what are some typical features of the experience of living in modern states? The first, I think, is that we do not see ourselves as living in modern states. Rather, we live in societies, whereas we live within or under a state. The state-society distinction seems self-evident to us, whereas it is unintelligible within the other 2 phenomenological orders. Well, Andrew, and so I've been reading both of Andrew's books recently, and they're marvelous books, and so but I always have my criticisms, so I'm picking on Andrew tonight. Sorry, Andrew. But just as we're starting, maybe to be friends, I hope this isn't a problem for us. While Andrew's very good at cautioning against taking anachronistically the concept of the state as a given and talking of the state of Louis IX, he does tend to use society in exactly the sense that is correlative to the state. He speaks of Louis reordering society according to the reform vision that he shares with the Pope, and this clearly means French society, which apparently means the populace living within France and the characteristic interactions among them. So likewise, when we speak of a society, unless we're talking about some kind of voluntary association, like Society for Creative Anachronism, for example, what we generally mean is the populace within the territory of a given nation-state. American society, for example. By contrast, in Augustine's City of God, societas, as far as I can tell, never refers to a group of people under a single political rule. It means association, alliance, fellowship, the company you keep. The earthly city and the heavenly city are such societies precisely because they are not circumscribed national populaces, but rather by virtue of the way the 2 groups of angels and men associate with each other in obedience or in resistance to God. Augustine does speak on a few occasions of the societas of Roman citizens, but precisely to make the point that stage actors, for example, are excluded from it, as are other members of the populace, like slaves. So how do state and society come to be distinct? One way would seem to be by the formation of the ruling power into a centralized administration, which in Europe started to happen under really high medieval, but late medieval and early modern monarchs especially. So while the reforms of Louis IX do not belong teleologically to a story of state formation, and I think it's one of the important arguments in Andrew's book, this doesn't necessarily change the fact that they do lay some of the groundwork for that later development, as does indeed the whole so-called legal revolution of which Louis's reforms are a part. The teleology certainly needs debunking, but that does not erase the historical links. But it's a complicated story. At the same time, however, the centralization of ruling administrations is not in itself a historical necessity and doesn't seem likely to be irreversible, while I do wish to argue that in a certain sense the modern state is. And this is something I think is missing in discussions by my friend David and others about liberalism. It seems very likely that liberalism may be, if not reversible, then at least something that may fail and be replaced. It is not clear that the same is true of the modern state. And if it is true of the modern state, then we have a lot to worry about and think about, which we haven't. And this is one reason I think we need clarity on the distinction. So let me try to clarify that distinction a bit more. And I will draw upon the insightful description of the state by Max Weber. Weber famously describes the state, and I'm consolidating two different ways that he puts it in two different works, as roughly an administrative organization that successfully holds a monopoly on legitimate violence within a definite territorial boundary. This seems to capture something phenomenologically decisive, something that to a certain degree Hobbes also recognized when he first theorized the sovereign authority of the modern state. The suggestion of a sort of group of people that I'm broadly criticizing or questioning, at least, Andrew, David, John Milbank, seems to be that it was the victory of bad metaphysics and theology that brought about this conception of the state in terms of the primacy of violence. My suggestion might be seen as the inverse, that it was the transformation of violence that made the state inevitable, and that in turn helped make the bad metaphysics seem more compelling than its own merits would have done. So this transformation of violence then brings me back to July 2nd, 1600. On that date, Count Maurice of Nassau commanded a Dutch army against the Spanish at the Battle of Nieuport. He decisively demonstrated, for the first time, that a well-drilled body of men with muskets could prove effective and even decisive against any other kind of force. In the subsequent half-century, firearms became the dominant weapon on the battlefield. At the end of that half-century, the 1648 Treaty of Westphalia, to some degree, made the territorial nation-state the new European norm, or began to anyway, and in 1650, Hobbes provided its theoretical rationale in Leviathan. So it's true, quoting from Before Church and State, that in 13th century France, legitimate power was not monopolized, and there was no notion that it should be. But I don't think it's right to say, as the next sentence does, the desirability of a monopoly on the use of force is a consequence of the belief in the ubiquity of violence. When that belief falls, this desirability falls with it, end quote. If I have to be blunt, I'm going to say I think that's rubbish. The desirability of a monopoly on the use of force results from a change in the dominant way of exerting that force, a change that is irreversible in principle. Similarly, to take another quote, the monopoly of violence that sovereignty demands is actually organizationally possible only through the technology of the modern state, which I think is absolutely right. And, continuing the quote, the ideological component of sovereignty, the belief that monopolized violence is legitimate, is constructed and sustained only as a response to the conviction of the ubiquity of violence. And that is the part that I think is not right. The organization of the modern state does make the monopolization of violence possible, but that is because the change to firearm warfare gives violence a form that is, for the first time, susceptible of monopolization. The state is not responding to a metaphysical conviction, however much that may be at work on some level, but practically to a technological reality when it monopolizes violence. This change seems responsible ultimately for the distinction between state and society as well. In the feudal agrarian order, every able-bodied male is on occasion a soldier, or at least always potentially a soldier, at least for defensive purposes. And his weapons and his place in the military order correspond to his place in the socio-political order, since these are the same order. This sort of force is necessarily local and decentralized, and does not depend on taxation, except to equip heavily armored knights. There's not a whole lot for a royal administration to do, at least until the legal revolution gets going. But when every able-bodied man can be given a gun and deployed to the field, if those guns are to be sufficiently standardized to make drill effective, and if the forces are to be massed in the large numbers that now become even more advantageous than ever before, a central taxing, provisioning, and commanding authority is needed. As a result, the population under a modern state becomes distinguished into, on the one hand, professional soldiers who are now part of the state and mostly socially invisible, except when they're being quartered upon people, and on the other hand, civilians who constitute the society. And of course, I'm drastically condensing something that happened really over the course of 3 centuries, and there's some good stuff about this actually in Andrew's second book. So these 4 characteristic phenomena of the modern state are connected. The rule of a central taxing, spending, and commanding administrative body that we call the state, the resulting state-society distinction, the monopolization of violence, and the fact that modern soldiers fight with guns. Also connected is the transformation from agrarian economy to money economy. And along with it, the major social fact Tocqueville saw as distinctive of modernity, which is the equalization or democratization of social conditions. Conditions in this sense really meaning rank more than anything else. Central to this democratization is the fluidity of social status or relative rank, which follows from the fact that agrarian feudal order is no longer relevant to the strength and defensibility of a territory. And as feudal order dissolves, territory itself ceases to be defined by places and terrains and feudal domains with fluctuating boundaries, and now becomes defined by abstract borderlines on either side of which a different administrative power monopolizes violence, or at least tries to. When social conditions are fluid, then, when the soldiery is professionalized, when rule is consolidated into the state, then the structure of lived community will no longer correspond to a socio-political and military order of command. In the medieval world, all are potentially warriors, but at the same time, the ruling knights and lords are the warriors par excellence. Analogously to the ancient city, where the citizen warrior statesman sets a standard of character and action, the knight is expected to serve as a standard of virtue that fellow sometime warriors can recognize as partly defining a moral political hierarchy. As Pierre Manon argues in Natural Law and Human Rights, the modern state does not encourage action, and it rarely commands, but rather mostly forbids or prevents action. And this is how the protection of individual rights usually works, by preventing actions that infringe upon their spheres of immunity. Consequently, the state innervates the capacity for self-commanding action and thus for moral character and virtue. It favors the negative self-limitation of refraining from acting upon others. True command and obedience is at home only in the soldiery, who, again, tend to be socially invisible. Now, at this point, as a good Platonist, it's worth articulating something that I think is an essential principle of any political phenomenology. As my emphasis on military character and its visible exemplarity suggests, one thing an adequate political phenomenology should do is to make clear what the thumatic or spirited or irascible part of the soul gets attached to and how it gets channeled within the political order in question and that political order's way of shaping the imagination. Tocqueville, Nietzsche, and Fukuyama all testify that there is something innervating about the modern state, especially to the degree that it slides toward greater administrative centralization. And I've connected this to the social invisibility of the soldier, to the passivity of the protected civilian, to the stifling of action in the expansive rights regime. So this leads us to ask, is thumos, the irascible, simply deadened in the modern state, or does it get channeled and attached in a different and less obvious way? Or maybe increasingly more obvious way in our last decade or so. So I would argue the latter. And this brings into view the fundamentally technocratic character of the modern state as such. So let's consider Hobbes for a moment, psychologically speaking. In this famous chapter on the state of nature as a state of war, Hobbes sums up the sources of conflict and the sources of peaceful coexistence. In each case, there are 3. In the nature of man, we find 3 principal causes of quarrel. First, competition. Secondly, diffidence. Thirdly, glory. The passions that incline men to peace are fear of death, desire of such things as are necessary to commodious living, and a hope by their industry to obtain them. Now, these triads line up with one another. For what is it? What is the object of men's competition? Mainly the commodities that they desire. Why are men diffident? Because they fear their competitors, which ultimately means they fear death. So that leaves us with glory and hope. And what's their relationship? Well, glory is the form in which the thumos, the irascible soul of the feudal aristocrat, is channeled, which is why Hobbes thinks it needs to be canceled, eliminated. Hope of acquisition, attaching the will to hard work and desiring security, is the form in which the thumos of the bourgeois subject is channeled. So there's a metamorphosis of thumos that Hobbes recommends. And in a certain sense, psychologically speaking, this is consistent with medieval scholastic thought, because in the case of the theological virtues, the virtue of hope is the virtue that's specifically pertinent to the irascible appetite. But of course, that's a different kind of hope, and that is really my point. The modern state channels the irascible, the thumos, into a hope that is in accord with a different theology, a technocratic mythology. Theological hope is rerouted into mythological optimism. So consider the state. The state, through its monopoly on violence, consolidates power into itself in such a way as to bring about unprecedented force, to enforce the will of the sovereign. But the sovereign represents, in some sense, the will of the people. And of course, representation in its modern meaning is another feature, phenomenon of the modern state, but don't have time for that one. Represents the will of the people, at the very least, their will for security, according to Hobbes, and more so in, let's say, the COVID era. The state, in this sense, is imagined as an instrument of the human will, one that operates not on the scale of moral action, but on a scale that promises a transformation of the conditions of life for a people. The gun-powered state can aspire to change the world, which it effectually does by undoing medieval order in the first place. It provides the imaginative scope for the mythology of progress, in which the mythic figure of humanity is imagined to be the subject of the action of history. And history is understood as the action of using large-scale institutions to transform the conditions of human life, progressively overcoming their previously accepted limits. And of course, the mythology is partly a mystification, because it's some people, right? Some people constitute humanity as agents, and others as, most of the others, as those acted upon ultimately. In this mythological, psychological transformation, thumos, spiritedness, is detached from personal action and is channeled through the state as the paradigmatic institutional instrument, which enables other institutional instruments to exist as well. For example, the community of scientific research for the relief of man's estate, as Bacon put it, and Descartes and the whole propagandists of modern science. Thumos takes on the form of optimism about history as progress. And there's something bewitching about this, because it is a grand action in which I participate by authorizing these institutions to transform the conditions of existence. This is the mythological hope cultivated by conditions of life in the modern state. And I'll suggest that here exactly is where we find the root of what Heidegger describes as the technological ontology of modernity. At least Gunpowder is arguably the form of standing reserve, in Heidegger's term, that first makes itself evident as such. And Maurice of Nassau's system of drill, which is broken down into many, many steps and with each its own command, is an early form, one might say, of tailorization that we find in the industrial production process, which subordinates the movements of the human body to the efficient operation of what is supposedly its mechanical instrument. And just as an interesting side note, Descartes, in the period of his life between his being a law student and becoming a techno-philosopher, the interim period, he was a military engineer in precisely the unit commanded by Maurice of Nassau. So that's kind of interesting, but hard to know how much one can make of that. So the state, as a world-transforming instrument, one that relieves its subjects of the need for the responsible action of self-governing, reshapes the political imagination. Practical wisdom becomes enfeebled. Political thinking takes on an ideological shape and habit. Ideological thinking is precisely a form of technocratic thinking, for which the state is a transformative instrument, one that arouses quasi-eschatological hopes for some kind of final solution to the human problem. And this gives thumos one of its other characteristic modern forms, which is rage that the state is not achieving the transformative goals that serve as the axioms of my faction's ideology. And therefore, it's their fault that it's not happening. We know a lot about that right now. Liberalism itself is a family of such ideologies at home in the modern state, and in many ways the most successful of them so far. But again, the modern state is likely to outlast liberalism. So I'm going to skip just a little bit here. But just a quick remark. There's a general then tendency, and David knows because I've given him a hard time about this on numerous occasions, among people, and John Milbank is kind of one of the best examples, to think that well, the problem is bad theological metaphysics, and so the solution would seem to be good theological metaphysics, and that should kind of set things straight if we can just get that sorted out. And I think arguably that way of thinking about political change itself falls into the pattern of that's set for us by the technocratic state as the sort of form in which ideas work their way into governing our lives. But that's a longer argument that I'm going to skip over for now. But given that, but if that's the case, right? If there's a kind of falling into a pattern of a kind of channeling of the spirited part of the soul, right, towards this kind of expectation of transformative power of ideas. It seems to me that there's a certain spiritual discernment that is required if one is going to engage in both a kind of polemical critique, but also one that attracts young people to certain kinds of hopes that they invest their passions in for transformation of the political world, which I see happening a lot among young people. And particularly in the New Polity kind of fan club, which again I'm all for. I think New Polity is doing great stuff, but again, something just to sit with a bit. 5 minutes, all right. All right. So briefly, then I'm gonna then say something. Given these three very different political phenomenologies. I want to say something about the common good as a political phenomenon. And so if we're going to, I would argue that if we're going to try to understand the common good as a political phenomenon, we have to think about how it manifests itself, to what degree it manifests itself in these different phenomenological fields. And so I'll truncate this. I'll boil it down very briefly. I think it's a mistake. I think it's a product of people kind of looking at Aristotle through the kind of filter of Aquinas, to think that Aristotle considers the common good a political phenomenon, which is not something that he ever says. He talks about common advantage as a criterion of a good or bad regime, right? A good monarchy rules for common advantage, a tyranny for the private advantage of the ruler. The place where Aristotle does speak explicitly of common goods, and this touches back on David Crawford's remarks, is within the family, and specifically the family as a form of friendship, right? The friendship of the family is grounded on fundamentally the common good that the children are, the friendship between husband and wife. And if we think about, of course, how Aristotle understands the best cases of friendship, we see, well, this is the case where there's really a common good, right? The common good of virtue, of the good, the moral good, the good of the human being that is loved by the two people in common in each other, and so on. And in Aristotle's understanding of the kind of mixed political order, that has a very narrow place to operate within the poly, right? And one of the keys to a well-ordered mixed regime in Aristotle's sense is to cultivate a group of friends, virtuous, wise friends who are statesmen and who form a kind of core of effective statesmanship. And if you look at Cicero's Republic and Cicero's dialogue on friendship and the relationship that he establishes between those two things, you see that Cicero's taking that idea and saying, well, actually in Rome we did have this for several generations and it was good, right? And then now we're at the end of that. Now, with Augustine, with the Christian dispensation, the Christian understanding of the communion of the faithful introduces the possibility of a real and effective presence of a true common good. So God as common good is manifested in the communion in the church, right? Through the supernatural mediation of Christ, the shared love for virtue and truth that is at the heart of true friendship comes to be constitutive of the whole community of Christians, at least in principle, united by the love of God who is goodness and truth, and which is fully operative in Christ himself, and which we participate in to the extent that we participate in his love. And there's a fairly low bar for entering into that friendship, thank God. And it requires humility as opposed to the sort of pride and greatness and nobility of the pagan friends. Humility, receptivity, right, being a part of an ordered whole makes this possible. Now, the political ramifications of this, well, this is something that we're talking a lot about these days, and they're not at all obvious. But what this gives us, I think, what the helpful thing that this gives us, I'm just going to go a minute or two over here. The helpful thing that this gives us is a way of thinking about how we locate common goods, right? Because one of the problems, I think, in conversations about the common good is that it's too abstract, right? That is to say, where we find, to take Aristotle as a kind of guide, right? Where we find common goods is in friendships and in what constitutes those friendships. What is at the heart of those friendships? What are they about? What do they care about? What are they trying to cultivate, preserve, make fecund? And so there's a sense in which we need to make a distinction between at least three levels of the phenomenality of the common good, if we're thinking politically. Right, so there's the highest level, the city of God, in which God is the common good, and communion, right, the good of communion, is the constitutive good of the human relationship in that and on that level. And in a certain sense, it's trans-political, but also giving a kind of fuller vision to the political. On the middle level is the various kinds of friendship right? Including friendships. Aristotle talks about citizen friendship, right? He says that lawgivers aim at friendship. Friendship, he says, seems to hold cities together, and lawmakers seem to take it more seriously than justice. For like-mindedness seems to be something similar to friendship, and they aim at this most of all and banish faction most of all for being hostile to it. Again, a very pertinent consideration in our time. So there's true friendship as we know it, just kind of naturally phenomenologically, but then it has its analogous manifestations in different political relationships, right? The relationships among citizens, the relationships of ruler to ruled, right? The relationships within a ruling class, which becomes in John of Salisbury at the beginning of the legal revolution, becomes a very important consideration for a kind of well-ordered court, right? His book is about the courtiers and their virtues and vices. And Aquinas has a great discussion in De Regno of friendship between ruler and ruled, based on the ruler's protection of a way of life and a kind of showing a kind of friendship, showing that the ruler doesn't despise the ruled, but cares for their good. So, and then on the that brings us kind of to the level below that, which is the compendium idea, right? Which is to say there are conditions. There are conditions that make possible these substantive friendships of various kinds and various relationships that are built around common goods that are distinctive to those relationships and what they're able to care for, right? And what they're able to bind people around. So this is one reason why I think if we're going to think fruitfully about the common good as a political phenomenon, we have to really understand the political phenomenological fields in which we are trying to make sense of the common good or the relevant common goods as they operate both as the anchors of community and friendship, and as that to which, into which, through which, in relation to each other, our passions, and especially our spirited, irascible passions, get attached, channeled, and cultivated into virtues. Thank you.